when some idiot starts out with the Cambrian period and comes up to the Cenozoic, Mesozoic, and Paleozoic ages, and comes up through the Carboniferous period and all this, you know the party line. He simply arranges the objects to suit himself. That's what it amounts to. And that's about all it amounts to. The evidence of organic evolution are supposed to be genetics and controlled breeding, supposedly greyhounds and dachshunds. A Shetland pony and a draft horse are supposed to bring about evolution in a, quote, limited way. The evidence from the fossils is called undeniable proof in the textbooks. When the fossils have been arranged in chronological order, they commonly show a series of changes that are readily explainable as the product of organic evolution. The truth of the matter is there isn't a fossil or one living thing they ever found before the Precambrian period, before the Cambrian period, and the fossil evidence for the Precambrian period is zero. The mechanics of evolution are supposed to be, according to Darwin and the best-educated brains of the day, variation, the struggle for existence, natural selection, heredity, and isolation. And of this Disneyland exegesis, we may say hee-haw with all due respect to those involved. The bigger the belfry, the more room for the bats. And like my maid told me one time, she said, if you ain't got no education, you just got to use your brains. The supposedly geological ages they set up in eras are supposed to be measured, first of all, by the salt content of the sea, supposed to be fresh water with soil washed away, by the deposition of sediments, by the rate of erosion, which isn't always consistent, and by the disintegration of radioactive material and mineral, specifically radioactive carbon-14. The study of all this man-made hocus-pocus and mumbo-jumbo begins with the Greek philosophers who got very upset about marine deposits and shells and rocks removed from seawater. Xenophanes and the rest of them way back there before the time of Christ, Herodotus and Empedocles and Aristotle, all rejected the biblical account of the flood. They were negative on the gods to retain their social standing, and they thought the fish wandered inland through underground rivers. Leonardo da Vinci denied a universal flood and attacked the idea that it could have formed fossils. The whole trouble began when they began to find fish heads and fish skeletons on mountains. That's where the whole stink came from to start with, that it was a rejection of the days of Noah. Nicholas Steno, 1638 to 1687, was the first to kid people into thinking that rock strata were deposited in normal succession so as to rule out a catastrophe like the flood. And, of course, those of us who studied such phenomena as polystrate fossils have better sense to believe a cock and bull story like that. You can find scores of trees buried in 4 or 5 layers of sediment, which were supposed to be 150,000 years apart, and yet the trees have been preserved intact. Another very embarrassing thing that stands against evolution is the so-called ossiferous fissures, where they find graveyards composed of bones of all kinds of animals, camels and rhinoceroses, or rhinoceri, together in Nebraska with a man's bones, and how all the animals suddenly got together on high ground, all got buried together without fighting or killing each other, is a mystery past finding out. But it never has bothered this bunch of characters. You can't explain it in any way except that animals were running for their life to high ground when the flood came. And there are many other holes in the argument. The deposit of loess, the fine volcanic silt that lies around different parts of the earth at high altitudes, shows that it was deposited by water that was going out through the bottom of a deep, like water out of a bathtub. We also find very embarrassing questions brought up about Darwin's theory in regard to erratic boulders, which glaciers were supposed to have moved, which they couldn't possibly have moved. They've gone over them. And there's always those embarrassing erratic boulders that have moved from the equator toward the North Pole. Exactly what glacier began in Mexico and Florida and moved up to Kansas is a little bit hard to say. So much for the monkey to man theory, or as one has so aptly put it, once I was a tadpole when I began to begin, and then I was a frog with my tail tucked in. Next I was a monkey in a banyan tree. Now I'm a doctor with a Ph.D. The question that Darwin couldn't answer, your college professor couldn't answer, are the following. How do plunging birds attacking know that the fastest velocity cannot be attained by a perpendicular plunge due to the tilt of the earth on its axis and the consequent atmospheric motion and pressure? The arch of the cycloid by which they plunge was only known by 2 men in the 18th century. How did the birds find that out 150,000 B.C. according to evolutionists? Somebody said instinct. That isn't instinct, that's imparted wisdom. What about the female mackerel that lays 500,000 eggs at one time? 10 years of progeny of every egg would fill the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean with fish to a depth of 32,000 feet solid. The herring for 20 years would equal the bulk of the globe, 338 trillion tons of herring, unless there wasn't a way to get rid of them. Who equipped the fish to divide H2O into 1/3 and utilize the oxygen through its gills? That principle is used in the laboratory now, but who taught the fish to do it? Who equipped a fish to divide H2O into 3 parts and then get the oxygen out of it? Somebody said it's instinct. Why, it's nonsense. A man couldn't do it. By experiment in a laboratory until the last 400 years. In Malaysian water, there's a fish with bifocal eyes. There are no internal combustion engines operated satisfactorily until a British physician took a French mechanic into his surgery and applied the principle of the heart valve to the gasoline motors. Now, how about the one who invented the principle? How come the fish knew about it? All cells in the body are renewed every 28 days. Who does this? Animals have no memory for anything abstract, yet men do. Who did that? There's no way to explain these things. These things coming up they keep calling instinct are nothing but imparted wisdom, and no animal in the world could have figured out how to do it. Nobody could have taught how the army ants how to go to the edge of the river and then ball up in a ball and roll across the river. You don't do that by experimentation. You do that by drowning. Explain it. The proportion of nitrogen and oxygen is consistent to 79 parts to 21 on sea level on the mountaintops anywhere in the world. And if you change that proportion of 79 to 21 to nitrogen 2 and oxygen 2, you'd have nitric oxide, which is a gas, and it would choke and contract the glottis, and you'd all strangle. If the proportion of nitrogen and oxygen was 2 to 1, like N2O, you'd have laughing gas. And if nitrogen was heavier than oxygen, which it's not, the whole Earth would be covered with gas. It'd be a death trap. Who measured the gases? Why, NO2 is the nitro group. You add glycerin and sulfuric acid, you get nitroglycerin. And NO2 dissolved in water is nitric acid.